Hello everybody, it is Desmond YGO here. Been a little while, but well, a topic I was looking at recently, I decided to do some deep thought and such about it, and I want to make a video about a particular card, and my sort of hot take, as it will, for this card. Of course, if you're seeing the screen, this is Nibiru, the Primal Being. Now, a lot of people may want to ask, well, or if you've already seen the title, why do I think this card is quite possibly one of the most, how do I say it, game-definingly annoying cards in existence? And not just because it's annoying in the sense of it does something annoying, but more in the sense that it actually really fucked up card design. And I kind of want to explain why here, because there's actually a clear difference in between how the game played before Nibiru till after Nibiru, but more importantly, that Nibiru sort of signals this change in how a defining portion of how the game plays, that it almost honestly, like, there are a lot of decks that potentially could have power in certain formats that were completely unviable just because Nibiru exists. So with that, let's get into it. So, to refresh for anyone who plays casually or hasn't seen this card, it's surprising, but it may occur. You have Nibiru the Primal Being. During the main phase, if your opponent is normal or special summon 5 or more monsters this turn, quick effect, you contribute as many face of monsters on the field as possible. If you do, special summon this card, then you special summon a token with attack and defense equal to the total attack and defense of the attributed monsters to your opponent's field. And you can only use this effect hard once per turn. So, why is this card so annoying? Well, the most obvious thing in terms of gameplay is that, okay, so if your opponent combos off a lot, you can just wipe their board. Which, then they have to play starting from there. Which, it is extremely annoying for the combo player. However, I think in the sense of what it's trying to do, which is disrupt combo decks from being able to just go off turn one without, a multiple amount of hand traps needed, or without, something like Max C, which, instead of stopping the combo, instead either allows your opponent to stop doing the combo and just pass, and you win, or you get to draw a bunch of cards, which means you might just have enough cards to out them. Nibiru does strike a sort of middle ground, because it acts as removal for control decks, for other combo decks, against the turn 1 combo, but it's also all in one package, which means it's easy to slot in, but at the same time that also makes it a little bit easier to stop, because unlike in the past where you could just dump hand traps at targets if you're playing like Spiral, for example, now you have Nibiru where if they have one negate, it's done. But if they don't have negate, it is much more punishing depending on the deck. So now that we've gone over some of the gameplay aspects, let me talk about the big issue. The thing where I kind of think Nibiru is a detriment to the game in a way that is very interesting. And that is, it has fundamentally changed how combo plays, works, and how they're designed as cards. And in some ways, Nibiru is directly part of the reason why decks such as Sprite are made as broken as they were, or stuff like Tier. Now, for those who don't know what Tier and Sprite both do, these decks both either have an out to Nibiru, or they have a straight up don't give a shit about Nibiru, depending on when they are hit. And I think this gives the perfect representative of why Nibiru is such a problem. Because both decks are built with the counter in mind. But what about older decks? A great example of a deck that can produce a massive end board, but if they don't get to a negate fast enough, they can just fail because Nibiru exists, and that is Synchron. There are other examples as well. Certain Lunalite variants couldn't play anymore. Pendulums is another big one, where if you Nibiru them, they die. And this is where it's an issue, because it's not that the card stops a lot of these combos that were super degenerate, and I mean like old-fashioned Dragon Link where you were ending on essentially 4 to 5 Omni negates with no real way to stop it other than literally super poly only, or like kaijus and shit like that. And then you had even worse ones like Thunder Dragon Link Orchest, which was basically just spam the board with every biggest boss monster in the game and say screw you. Now, this card deals with that partially, because it means that if you have this in hand and they can't get a negate early enough, they die. But to get back on point, this influences how cards are made in the future. For example, one of the major things people like to do now is if you're going for a full combo that requires a majority of your resource, you have to make a negate or some way of stopping it. What does that mean? That means combo decks in the future either have to have a way to stop it built into their deck, or they have to have the ability to play through it. For example, you have decks like Code Talkers, which, whilst Rogue, can sometimes actually play through a Nibiru because they have just that many resources. Synchron, if you hit them at the exact wrong time, can play through a Nibiru. I've seen it happen. And there are other decks that can do similar things. The issue is that not only does it essentially throw out old decks, like there are a lot of decks that just simply cannot make a negate underneath Nibiru. More importantly, it actually pushes power creep up by forcing Konami to say, oh, well, we want this deck to be combo, but we want it to be playable. How do we do that? Oh, I know. Let's make it to where it either doesn't care about Nibiru, doesn't need, can play through a Nibiru, or has the ability to just snipe the Nibiru. If anyone knows what decks these were, you have a great example of a deck that could do it before committing Infernoble with Aqua Dolphin and potentially a certain Ice Old combo. You have Sprite now with Gigantic Sprite locking it out. Tier, literally all the tier effects, if you haven't used them yet, trigger on being hit because it's treated as a card effect that tributes your monsters. You then have, other meta decks, etc., etc. So overall, what Nibiru's main problem is that it's changed combo into being more powerful. Nibiru was meant to be the card that basically equalizes combo, but it doesn't, because the decks that does equalize against combo, those decks don't see play because they get equalized. The only decks that do see play are the decks that can equalize, that don't care about it that much. Which means Nibiru not only failed its intended purpose to some extent, but the bigger issue is that you've now segmented an entire portion of the game out of the way, when, in all honesty, you just made cards that didn't care about it anyways. So you've kind of just made the same problem you had before. You just made it worse. To give a basic analogy, it's like medicine, for example. You give medicine to a bacteria. Eventually, this bacteria is not going to give a shit about the medicine anymore. And then you get an even worse bacteria in your body, or a worse virus. And that's what's occurring. So what do I think the issue is? Well, in more recent times, we have stuff like Forbidden Droplet and Dark Ruler, which can somewhat actively just deal with combo anyways. I mean, and with the abhorrent amount of decks that can just play through it anyways in the combo sphere, I really don't think Nibiru was a good choice of a card, like, to create, essentially. Now, what would I do with it going forward? Well, honestly, it stays unbanned. It's not broken. From a design standpoint, I would actually think tinkering with having Nibiru banned and potentially putting up another going second tool in its place, or even a slightly different hand trap would be better. Simply because Nibiru is essentially the gold standard for what your combo deck has to be. And if anything, that just reduces the diversity of combo. Hell, in some cases, it reduces the diversity of fucking mid-range and control decks. For example, there are technically turns where, simply put, any piece of removal, or let's say if you have a really bad example, would be Trap Tricks. You can be Nibiru'd under Trap Tricks. Why? Because you need to get Sarah, and if you open up the combo correctly, you end on a rank 4. You need to summon 5 monsters to do that. Which means that in a control deck, you can be Nibiru'd. And if you get Nibiru'd, you're dead in that control deck. Mid-range. I've seen Plunder do it. Now, the thing is with Plunder can somewhat play around Nibiru. But as you can see, as it keeps going, Nibiru just sets a standard for decks, and I think overall it reduces the diversity of formats in general. Now, as I said, should it be banned? No. Do I encourage certain formats to maybe test with it banned? Yes, actually, I think it might actually be an interesting thing to see what decks can come up when Nibiru isn't there. And more importantly, are there decks that can function without Nibiru being available that can compete with some of these biggest and best decks out there? Which is an interesting question. Now, with this all being said, this is all mostly opinion, backed up with some fairly recent examples, less than old ones. But mainly, I just wanted to make this just to put this thought in people's heads. People who run custom formats, or custom ban list formats, even custom servers. I currently run one. I actually haven't decided on what to do with Nibiru yet. But honestly, I think it would be a great sort of science experiment to see if removing Nibiru and maybe adding in a few more go second options, or even making another hand trap that does something a little bit not as polarizing, but still something that does remove cards off the field, and see how that would work. With all in all being said, though, this is Desmond12530 or DesmondYGO. And hopefully you guys enjoyed this little rant. Sorry that there's not much gameplay, but I just sort of wanted to make this as a straightforward, hey, I want to talk about this card. With that being said, it's DesmondYGO, and I'll be seeing you guys all later.